Welcome to Crazy HOA Moments. The board picked the wrong week to play games. You cannot block me in here, Laura. The gate logs will prove you triggered the lockout on purpose, and I have the vendor report right here in my hand. I work as a city permit tech in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I know exactly what requires a permit and what does not, which means I also know when someone is lying about property damage to shake me down for cash. Laura Davis, the safety committee chair for Fairview Snowbank HOA Incorporated, is screaming at me through a snow squall with a tow truck idling 20 feet behind her and a boot clamp key dangling just out of my reach. She thinks I am trapped. She thinks I have no proof. She thinks that because the gate system locked me inside the neighborhood during the worst squall of the season, I will panic and pay her fabricated fine to avoid the daily penalties she claims start tomorrow morning. She is wrong on every count, and the tow operator standing back and listening carefully is about to refuse the hook once I show him what I have. I moved to Fort Collins 3 years ago because the tech sector jobs were solid and the cost of living beat Denver. I bought a townhome in a planned community that looked clean and quiet in the summer listing photos, and I did not spend enough time reading the covenants before I signed. Fairview Snowbank HOA Incorporated runs on a cocktail of passive-aggressive enforcement and seasonal panic, and Laura Davis has turned the safety committee into her personal fiefdom. The rules here are not guidance, they are leverage, and Laura wields them like a weapon. My small business reputation is at risk because the HOA has been spreading lies about me damaging common property, and if I do not stop this tonight, the vendor contracts I rely on will hear those lies and start asking questions I cannot afford to answer. The trigger was my holiday lights. I left them up 2 weeks past the covenant deadline because an ice storm made it too dangerous to climb a ladder, and I documented the weather conditions in photos. Laura showed up the day after the thaw with her megaphone, the one she uses at the mailbox cluster to announce snow rules, and cited me anyway. She demanded I remove the lights immediately and submit close-up photos proving compliance within 24 hours, which is her favorite tactic under the forced photo inspection policy she pushed through last year. I complied. I sent the photos. She rejected them, claimed the photos did not show enough detail, and issued a second violation notice with double the fine. That was 3 weeks ago, and since then she has escalated to claims I damaged the entrance gate mechanism during a supposed ice scraping incident I have no memory of, because it never happened. 2 days ago, Laura sent a formal demand for proof in a format she never mentioned until that email. She wanted receipts, timestamps, and vendor statements proving I had not touched the gate during the week in question, and she gave me 72 hours to produce them or face a lien. I knew immediately it was a setup because the gate vendor does not issue those kinds of statements to residents, only to the HOA management company, which meant she was asking for something I could not provide so she could claim I was uncooperative. I started digging. I called the gate vendor directly, explained I was being accused of damage, and asked if they kept service logs that might show what actually happened. The technician I spoke to was sympathetic and said he would pull the logs and send me a summary report if the management company approved. I escalated to the management company, and they dragged their feet for 48 hours before finally agreeing to release a redacted version of the service call notes. The report arrived this morning about 6 hours before the snow squall hit. It was a single-page PDF with 3 key details. 1. The gate lockout event Laura is blaming on me occurred at a time when I was verifiably at work across town and logged into the city permit system with time-stamped entries. 2. The lockout was triggered by an intentional configuration change made remotely by someone with admin access to the gate control panel. 3. The vendor flagged the configuration as unusual and recommended the HOA audit access logs to determine who made the change and why. I printed the report, highlighted the 3 key sections, folded the page, and put it in my jacket pocket. I did not play my hand yet, and she thought that meant I had none. Laura escalated again this afternoon. She sent a mass email to the entire neighborhood claiming I had damaged common property, refused to cooperate with the investigation, and would be subject to daily fines starting tomorrow morning unless I paid the repair costs in full tonight. The email included a dollar amount that made my stomach drop because it was high enough to trigger vendor background checks if it went unpaid and ended up in collections. She closed the email with her catchphrase, "You signed the covenants. Now you live the covenants." I forwarded the email to my ally, a former HOA board member named Stan who quit last year after watching Laura bully 3 families out of the neighborhood over petty violations. Stan replied within 10 minutes. He said Laura was overplaying her hand. The board had no authority to impose daily fines without a hearing, and I should show up at the gate tonight with my evidence and force a confrontation in front of witnesses. I did not plan on the snow squall. The forecast called for light flurries, but by the time I left work, the sky had turned gray and heavy, and the roads were slick with fresh powder. I drove back to the neighborhood and swiped my access card at the gate. The light turned green, the arm lifted, and I pulled through. The arm dropped behind me, and I heard the lock mechanism click. I thought nothing of it until I tried to leave 10 minutes later to grab salt from the hardware store. I swiped my card at the exit reader. Nothing. I swiped again. The reader beeped once and flashed red. I tried a third time, and the screen displayed an error message I had never seen before. Access restricted. Contact management. I pulled out my phone and called the management company. The after-hours line put me on hold for 8 minutes before a recorded message said the gate system was experiencing technical difficulties and normal access would resume within 2 hours. I knew immediately it was Laura. The timing was too perfect, the error message too vague, and the 2-hour window too convenient. I texted Stan and told him I was locked in. He replied that Laura had been seen near the clubhouse an hour earlier, which is where the gate control panel is located, and that I should stay calm and document everything. I started recording video on my phone, narrating what was happening, and that is when I saw the headlights. A white pickup truck with amber flashers pulled up to the outside of the gate, and Laura climbed out of the passenger side. She was wearing her blue parka and red earmuffs, and she had the megaphone in one hand and her stack of chalk sticks in the other. She walked up to the gate, looked directly at me through the bars, and lifted the megaphone. "Pay the fine now, or the tow truck hooks your car and you walk home in the snow. You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants." The tow truck pulled up behind her pickup and I saw the driver step out. He was a middle-aged guy in a heavy coat and he looked uncomfortable. Laura waved him forward and pointed at my car. I rolled down my window and shouted that I had proof the gate lockout was intentional and that she had no authority to tow me for a fabricated violation. She laughed and said the board had already approved the tow under the emergency snow removal policy, which allows immediate removal of any vehicle blocking access during a declared snow emergency. I pointed out that my car was not blocking anything. It was sitting at the exit gate inside the neighborhood, and the only reason I could not leave was because someone locked me in. She ignored me and turned to the tow driver. The tow driver walked closer to the gate and asked Laura if she had documentation authorizing the tow. She pulled a folded paper from her coat and held it up, but she did not hand it to him. He squinted at it through the snow and asked if it was signed by the management company or just by her. She said it was signed by the board president and that was enough. He asked if the resident had been given notice and an opportunity to move the vehicle. She said I had been given multiple notices and had refused to comply, which was a lie, and I shouted that from inside the car. The driver looked at me, then at Laura, then back at the paper. He said he needed to see proof of authorization and proof of violation before he could hook the car, and that if there was a dispute, he preferred to let the management company sort it out in the morning. Laura lost it. She screamed that he was wasting her time, that the HOA had a contract with his company, and that if he refused to do his job, she would make sure the contract was canceled and his reputation destroyed. The driver took a step back and said he was not hooking anything without proper documentation, and that threatening him was not going to change his mind. Laura turned to me and held up a small metal object. It was the boot clamp key. She said if I did not pay the fine right now, she would have the tow driver boot my car instead of towing it, and I could sit in the cold until I decided to cooperate. The driver said he did not carry boots and had no intention of installing one without a court order. That is when I pulled out the folded page. I held it up so the driver could see the highlights through the snow, and I said I had a vendor service report proving the gate lockout was intentional configuration, and that Laura had triggered the restriction to trap me at the worst moment. The driver walked closer to the gate and asked if I could pass the document through the bars. I folded it tight and slid it through. He unfolded it, read the highlighted sections, and looked at Laura. He said the report clearly indicated the lockout was a remote admin action and not a mechanical failure, and that if the HOA was accusing me of damage while simultaneously locking me inside the neighborhood, that sounded like retaliation and he wanted no part of it. He handed the page back to me, walked to his truck, and climbed in. Laura chased after him, pounding on the driver's door and screaming that he was breaching the contract. He rolled down the window and said he would be happy to discuss it with the management company in the morning, but he was not touching my car tonight. The tow truck pulled away, and Laura stood in the road screaming after it. Then she turned back to me and said this was not over, that the board would hold an emergency meeting tomorrow and vote to impose the daily fines regardless of what the vendor report said, and that I could try to fight it in court if I wanted to waste my money. She walked back to the pickup, climbed in, and drove off. I sat in my car for another 20 minutes before the gate suddenly unlocked and the exit arm lifted. I drove out immediately, went straight to the hardware store for salt, and then drove to Stan's house. Stan read the vendor report twice and said it was exactly what we needed. He explained that the gate system logs were stored on the vendor's server, and that if Laura had remote admin access, every configuration change she made was time-stamped and traceable. He said we should request a full audit of the access logs and file a formal complaint with the management company, but that we needed to move fast because Laura would try to bury the evidence once she realized I had the report. I asked Stan if he thought the board would actually hold an emergency meeting, and he said Laura had done it before when she wanted to ram through a vote without giving residents time to organize. He said the best defense was to show up at the meeting with witnesses, evidence, and a clear ask, and to make the board choose between Laura's version of events and the documented facts. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. the next evening at the clubhouse. Laura sent the notice out at 8 a.m., which gave residents 10 hours to prepare, and she buried the agenda deep in a wall of text about snow emergency procedures and compliance expectations. The only action item listed was a vote to impose daily fines on a resident who had damaged common property and refused to pay. My name was not mentioned, but everyone knew it was me because Laura had already sent the mass email. I forwarded the meeting notice to Stan, and he said we needed to bring at least 3 other residents who were willing to speak up because Laura would pack the room with her supporters and try to shout us down. I spent the morning reaching out to neighbors who had been on the receiving end of Laura's enforcement tactics. 2 of them agreed to come to the meeting, a retired teacher named Angela who had been fined for parking her car 6 inches outside the designated visitor space during a snowstorm, and a software engineer named Marcus who had been cited for failing to shovel his driveway within 12 hours of a snowfall eve, and though he was out of town and had hired a service that did not show up. Both of them said they had been too intimidated to fight back at the time, but they were willing to stand with me now if it meant stopping Laura from doing the same thing to someone else. If this story has you hooked, smash that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next HOA disaster. At 4 p.m., 2 hours before the meeting, a certified letter arrived at my door. I opened it immediately and saw it was from the HOA attorney, a Denver firm Laura had used in the past to threaten residents with legal action. The letter demanded I pay the full amount of the alleged damage within 48 hours or face a lien on my property. I checked the postmark and the date stamp on the envelope, and I caught the mismatch immediately. The letter was dated 3 days earlier, but the postmark showed it had been mailed only yesterday, which meant Laura had backdated the letter to make it look like I had been given more notice than I actually received. I took photos of the envelope, the date stamp, and the letter itself, and I sent them to Stan with a note that we now had evidence of document fraud on top of everything else. Stan replied that the backdated letter was a huge mistake on Laura's part, because it showed intent to deceive and could be used to challenge any board action taken based on the timeline she was claiming. He said we should bring the envelope and letter to the meeting and ask the attorney to explain the discrepancy on the record. I agreed, and I spent the next hour drafting a short statement summarizing the facts, the vendor report proving the gate lockout was intentional, the access logs showing I was not in the neighborhood when the alleged damage occurred, the backdated demand letter, and Laura's pattern of using winter emergency as to harass residents she did not like. At 5:30, I drove to the clubhouse with Stan. Angela and Marcus met us in the parking lot, and we walked in together. The meeting room was already half full, and Laura was standing at the front with a stack of chalk sticks on the table in front of her and her megaphone sitting next to a plastic water bottle. She saw me walk in and smiled. The board president, a thin man in his 60s named Ed, sat at the head table with 2 other board members, and the HOA attorney sat in the front row with a leather folio open on his lap. Ed called the meeting to order at 6 p.m. and said the agenda included a vote on whether to impose daily fines on a resident who had damaged common property and refused to pay. Laura stood up immediately and asked to speak. Ed nodded, and Laura launched into a 5-minute monologue about how I had been uncooperative, had ignored multiple notices, and had caused significant damage to the gate mechanism through reckless behavior. She held up a photo she claimed showed scrape marks on the gate arm. and she said the repair estimate was based on a vendor quote she had obtained personally. She did not mention the vendor service report. She did not mention the access logs. She did not mention the fact that the gate had been remotely locked while I was inside the neighborhood. When Laura finished, Ed asked if I wanted to respond. I stood up and said I had documentation proving I did not cause any damage, and that the gate lockout Laura was using as justification for the fines was an intentional act by someone with remote admin access. I pulled out the vendor report and asked Ed if I could submit it into the record. Ed said yes, and I walked to the front and handed him the report. He read it slowly, and his expression changed. He looked at Laura and asked if she had seen this report. Laura said she had not, and that vendor reports were confidential and should not have been released to a resident without board approval. I said the management company had approved the release after I filed a formal request, and that the report clearly showed the lockout was not caused by damage, but by a configuration change made remotely. I said the access logs would show exactly who made the change and when, and that I was requesting a full audit of the gate system to determine whether the lockout was part of a pattern of retaliation. Laura interrupted and said I was making baseless accusations, and that even if the gate had been locked remotely, that did not prove I had not caused damage at some other time. I said the vendor report included timestamps showing I was logged into the city permit system at work when the alleged damage occurred, and that I had witnesses who could confirm I was not in the neighborhood that day. Ed asked the HOA attorney if the board could vote to impose fines based on Laura's claims without verifying the facts in the vendor report. The attorney said the board had a fiduciary duty to investigate before imposing penalties, and that if the vendor report contradicted the basis for the fines, the board should table the vote until the access logs were audited. Laura stood up and said the board did not need to waste time on an audit, and that the vendor report was irrelevant because the damage had already been assessed and the repair estimate had already been approved. Ed said the repair estimate was approved based on Laura's representation that the damage was caused by a resident, and that if the vendor report showed no physical damage occurred, then the estimate was invalid. Laura tried a different angle. She said the board had the authority to impose fines for non-compliance with HOA procedures, and that even if I had not caused damage, I had violated the photo inspection policy by submitting photos that did not meet the required specifications. I asked her to show me the written specifications she was referring to, and she pulled out a printed page and started reading from a section labeled Enforcement Checklist. I recognized it immediately because Stan had warned me that Laura had created her own checklist without board approval and had been using it to reject compliance submissions. I asked Ed if the enforcement checklist was an official HOA policy, and Ed said he had never seen it before. Laura said she had drafted the checklist as part of her role as safety committee chair, and that it was based on best practices she had researched. I asked if the board had voted to adopt the checklist, and Ed said no. I asked if the checklist had been distributed to residents before Laura started using it to reject submissions, and Ed said no. I said that meant Laura had been enforcing a policy that did not exist, and that every fine she had imposed based on the checklist was invalid. Laura turned red and said I was twisting the facts, and that the checklist was simply a tool to help her do her job more efficiently. Angela stood up and said she had been fined under the same checklist for a parking violation, and that Laura had rejected her appeal without explanation. Marcus stood up and said he had been cited for a snow removal violation based on a timeline Laura claimed was in the covenants, but when he checked the actual covenant language, the timeline was different. Ed asked Laura if she had been using the enforcement checklist to impose fines without board approval, and Laura said the board had given her discretion to manage compliance, and that the checklist was part of that discretion. The HOA attorney interrupted and said discretion did not include creating new policies or imposing penalties that were not authorized by the covenants, and that if Laura had been doing that, the board needed to address it immediately. Ed asked for a motion to table the fine vote until the gate access logs were audited and the enforcement checklist issue was resolved. One of the other board members made the motion, and it passed unanimously. Laura objected and said the board was letting me off the hook, and that if the vote was tabled, I would continue to damage property and ignore the rules. I said that was defamatory and that I had documented proof I had not caused any damage, and that if Laura continued to make false statements, I would file a formal complaint with the management company and request her removal from the safety committee. Laura stood up and said I could not threaten her, and that she had the full support of the board. Ed said that was not accurate, and that the board had just voted to table the fine pending an investigation. Laura said the investigation was a waste of time and that the board was caving to pressure from a resident who clearly had no respect for the rules. I said I had complete respect for the rules, but that I also had the right to expect the rules would be applied fairly and based on facts, not on personal vendettas. Laura grabbed her megaphone and her chalk sticks and walked out of the meeting room. The door slammed behind her, and the room went quiet. Stan stood up and said he wanted to put a motion on the table to request a special election to recall the entire board and replace it with new leadership that would commit to transparent enforcement and fair application of the covenants. Angela seconded the motion, and Ed said the board would need to review the recall procedures and schedule a vote if enough residents signed a petition. Stan said he would start collecting signatures that night, and that based on the number of people in the room who had been on the receiving end of Laura's tactics, he expected to hit the threshold within a week. The meeting ended at 7:30, and I walked out into the snow with Stan, Angela, and Marcus. The parking lot was empty except for our cars, and the wind had picked up. Stan said the recall effort would take time, but that the board's decision to table the fine vote was a huge win, and that once the access logs were audited, Laura would have no choice but to resign or face formal discipline. I asked what would happen if she refused to resign, and Stan said the board could remove her from the safety committee and strip her of enforcement authority, and that without her committee role, she would have no leverage. 3 days later, the management company released the gate access log audit. It showed that Laura had made 17 remote configuration changes to the gate system over the past 6 months, including 3 lockout events that occurred during snowstorms and targeted specific residents who had filed complaints against her. The audit also showed that Laura had accessed the system outside of normal business hours and had not logged any of the changes in the official maintenance records, which violated HOA policy and the vendor service agreement. The management company sent the audit to the board with a recommendation that Laura be removed from all enforcement roles immediately, and that the board adopt a formal policy requiring all gate configuration changes to be approved in writing and logged in real time. Ed called an emergency board meeting 2 days after the audit was released. Laura did not attend. Ed read the audit summary into the record and said the board had no choice but to remove Laura from the safety committee and revoke her access to the gate system and all other enforcement tools. He said the board would also be adopting an enforcement checklist that had been reviewed by the HOA attorney and that would be distributed to all residents before it took effect, and that any fines imposed under Laura's personal checklist would be refunded. He said the board was committed to restoring trust and ensuring that enforcement actions were based on facts and applied fairly to everyone. The recall petition collected enough signatures to trigger a special election, and the vote was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Laura resigned from the board 2 days before the election, and Ed announced he would not seek re-election. The election brought in 3 new board members who ran on a platform of transparency and accountability, and the first thing they did was hire a new management company and fire the HOA attorney who had sent the backdated demand letter. The new board also voted to adopt a policy clarification that destroyed Laura's favorite tactic. Any enforcement action based on photo inspections would now require written specifications to be provided to the resident at the time of the initial notice, and any rejection of submitted photos would have to include a detailed explanation of what was missing and a second opportunity to comply before fines could be imposed. I got a refund check for the fines Laura had imposed on me, along with a formal apology letter from the new board president. Angela and Marcus got refunds too, and Angela told me she heard that 2 other families who had been forced to sell their homes because of Laura's harassment were considering legal action against the old board for failing to stop her. Stan said the recall vote had sent a message that residents would not tolerate abuse, and that the new board had a real chance to rebuild the community if they stayed committed to fair enforcement and open communication. The next snowstorm hit 2 weeks later, and for the first time in 3 years, I did not get a single violation notice. I shoveled my driveway on my own schedule, put up my holiday lights without fear, and drove in and out of the neighborhood gate without wondering if someone was going to lock me inside. Laura moved out of the neighborhood a month later, and the rumor was that she bought a condo in a building with no HOA and no rules. I have not seen her since, and I do not miss the megaphone or the chalk sticks or the constant dread of finding another fabricated fine notice taped to my door. The board adopted the enforcement checklist that limits Karen tactics, and Laura got corrected by the HOA attorney in plain language when he told the board her discretion did not include inventing policies. The funny karma moment came when Laura confidently read the wrong rule section out loud at the meeting, trying to justify her enforcement checklist, and Ed stopped her mid-sentence to point out she was citing a section that applied to commercial properties, not residential homeowners. The payback vector was the policy clarification that destroyed her favorite tactic, and the final consequence was a special meeting that turned into a recall vote, resignations cascaded, and new leadership took over before the next storm hit. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.